We were seen as weird, but we didn't see ourselves that way. The rest of the universe was crazy. Who would have thought that planets with liquid water could have supported life? Liquid water? You might as well swim in liquid nitrogen while you're at it. So there we were, silica-covered creatures in a carbon universe. The only reason anyone would talk to us was because we could make their star drives for a quarter of the price. Then it was clear that they just wanted you to leave as soon as possible, so we kept to ourselves as much as we could. As social beings, we would have liked to get to know these strange, cold people. But it seems their hearts were as cold as their worlds, because as soon as we entered a system, we were told that we had to leave unless we had something to sell because their homes could not be safely entered. We had our own ways of making up for the vast gulf in comfort zones, and if they would please give or sell us a place that was pretty remote for the purpose, we could take care of the installation. Then they made other excuses, like your generators are too high-powered, and if we let one of them break down on the surface, it would be a disaster. Well, we did some simulations, and it wouldn't be any worse than one of yours blowing up, but it's still too risky, and they didn't have an alternative. Soon, we got the message, stopped trying to make friends, and settled for making money instead. We were used to being seen as useful freaks in the galaxy by the time humanity arrived. Psychologically, they weren't that different from any other species. They were just more rambunctious than most, but that was probably because they were still getting used to the idea of a bigger universe and had all the energy curds. After a century or two, when the shock wore off, we didn't hear much in the way of rumors, but it was clear to us that these humans were different. Instead of growing up and taking their place on the galactic stage, they kept exploring for the sake of exploring and doing other things that the galactic community thought were wasteful and hedonistic. The humans responded to this attitude with the same maturity that they showed in their own behavior. They kept acting the same way they had before, though having met some of them, I think they took pleasure in spitting in the eye of authority. We got here because we wanted to explore and discover, they said. Now that we're here, you want us to turn around and adopt an attitude that would have kept us planet-bound until the sun blew up. No thanks, or something to that effect. We were bound to meet because their starship's engines needed to be replaced, and we had already snared that market a long time ago. Looking back, we shouldn't have been so surprised that it went the way it did. They had heard of us and been warned to stay away. But when you need an engine, you need an engine. So I found myself in front of a video screen with a human-like being. They looked weird, but at least they were symmetrical vertically. Even stranger to the human than it was to me, it jumped out of its chair and, if I understood the tone correctly, was swearing vehemently and calling on a god. As per standard practice, both sides of the conversation were muted, and the translators were the only ones who could hear. But I didn't need a direct line to know that the human was yelling at its coworkers, though I couldn't be sure why because the only noun it was using wasn't translatable. In less than 10 minutes, we were. I quickly looked it up in the wider interspecies dictionary, but it must have been a human-only word because I couldn't find it in any of them. Also, the human language dictionary was woefully incomplete. Eventually, they calmed down, and the person whose job it was to communicate said, "I'm sorry that your appearance caught me off guard." The human tone was far more respectful than any I had ever heard. We wanted to replace our alpha catalyzing ring before it was too far gone, but that note of respect seemed a little strange. Would you like us to install it, or would you rather do it yourself? One of the humans' mouths twitched up on one side. You probably know more about what needs to be done than we do. If you're willing to install it, that would be great. The other human started mumbling something excited. I couldn't tell what it was, but it sounded like it was about how the ship. I almost broke protocol by asking them to define the word they kept using. But at the last second, my brain caught up with my mouth, and I finalized the repair schedule instead. The repair went pretty well. Their alpha ring was badly corroded and would have blown out after their next jump, so we replaced it and sent them on their way. I was confused by their attitude, but I put it out of my mind as an oddity to look into later. It was I was on communications again, torn between following the rules and being interested in what they saw. When they looked at me, the big human's eyes seemed to get twice as big, and I thought, damned if Posa wasn't telling the truth. There are real untranslatables in the universe. I asked them why they were here, and they said it was for a simple repair. It was so simple that I was pretty sure they had purposely looked for our ship. After that, we started getting human ships pretty often, and since we weren't too far from the main route, stopping at one of our yards, unless absolutely necessary, was almost unheard of. Naturally, some of us started to think that either humans were up to something or one of the other civilizations has set them up to something. What they were up to depended on who told us, but everyone had a different plan. For the most part, I ignored the hashk. I studied human culture and history to find the word they kept using to describe us, but I wasn't successful. I learned their language, but speaking anything was nearly impossible because of the way our mouths are built. Those fleshy flaps in front of their teeth seem to play a big role in all of their languages, and I think that lips like that make intelligent conversation more difficult than it's worth. I wish I had found. What happened next was much easier to understand. When the human ambassador showed up, the yard went crazy with excitement. The idea that a species had regular contact with us was unheard of, and the idea that they would actually send someone to talk was somewhere between a fever dream and an actual impossibility. At that point, I had the most experience dealing with them, so I was naturally picked to greet the ambassador. I knew I would die of shame if that happened. The human was wearing an environmental protection suit, which made it hard to tell if the ambassador was male or female. I hoped they wouldn't take offense if I used the wrong pronoun. We had long since done away with the position of ambassador because no one was willing to get within miles of us, and their unwillingness to work with us meant that the only thing other sapiens saw of us was that text and communication was rare, and most people would rather ignore our existence. So I was picked to represent our race, or at least our yard, which was the biggest of its kind at the time. That's probably why humans made contact there. They, like most people, think that something big must be important because it takes more work to keep it up. Moderately sized things to a few large ones if all other factors are equal. There's a saying in their language about eggs in baskets that refers to this, but I can't remember the exact phrase. I was vaguely familiar with their gestures, so when the suited human bowed its head to me, I knew to do the same. "Welcome to the graveyard," I said. "My name is Kaki, and I'd like the honor of accompanying you." I was hoping that I was just taking a harmless comment in the worst way possible, but my stomach started to clench nervously. "Then, please come this way." I started to walk towards the room that had been set aside for the conference. Once the human was sitting down on the bench that had been shaped to fit its body, I asked what the point of its visit was. To be honest, we weren't sure either. The human said, "You see, we have a planet in our solar system that you can't just give things away for free, especially something as big as a planet. The military types are crazy about how close you'd be to our home planet, but the rest of us think that just because everyone calls you the untranslatable equivalent of monsters of the universe doesn't mean that's true. We're willing to give you a chance, especially since you haven't been aggressive at all." For long periods of time, I stared at the human sir. Strange joke. Excuse me, but could you say that again? It sounds like you're offering us a planet. I stuttered, but I was too shocked to really care. The human's tone took on a clear note of amusement. In a way, it's completely unsuitable for us, but someone did some math just for fun, and it turns out it's a lot like the one you came from. Those of us with more progressive minds decided that if someone else could use it, something like an agreement, I just stood there staring at them like a fool for what seemed like minutes. "I'm here mostly to see if you're interested in the idea as a whole," the human said in a friendly voice. "The official agreement will likely take weeks or months to hammer out, even if everything goes perfectly." It seemed amused by this, and for some reason the human reached out with its upper limb and waved it in front of my forward. I bit my tongue until I was calm enough to say, "I'm fine." I took a few deep breaths and tried to get my thoughts in some kind of order. I can't speak for everyone, and I don't have the authority to give you any kind of official, but I don't think that our leadership would be against the idea at all. The voice sounds excited and pleased by my answer. I will let my superiors know we'll send a message on the next chi. As it went home, I told it good luck with its journey and looked at the 2 narrow benches where the human had been sitting while we talked. A colony, our first colony, I thought. We might get a real colony on a real planet instead of roving bands of ships strewn together. Planets that we could occupy without extreme and expensive terraforming were so rare that it was hard to believe, and all of the solar systems that had them were already occupied and hostile, except now someone was willing to let us move in. To make a long story short, it took about 7 years of negotiations. This was partly because we weren't sure if they were sincere, and the other races were making a lot of noise about how the humans would regret being friends with such unnatural beings. But in the end, we came to an agreement that worked for both of us. We got Venus, and it was ours to do with as we pleased. Terraform it, blow it up, whatever. One grumpy diplomat said that in exchange, everyone who lived there and wasn't poor would pay a 1% tax to the Terran government, and our yards would build or fix up 500,000 tons of ships, which was enough for 15 medium-sized freighters, 3 large warships, or about half of the repairs their navy needed. They'll probably end up paying you for the other half, one of the delegates said, and they did. Venus wasn't a paradise. It was too hot for us, and it was atmosphere by almost 10% and changed the ratios of some less common gases. It cooled off enough that the weather was pretty nice, and the atmosphere was even denser than the one we were used to. However, it wasn't so dense that it was hard to breathe. In fact, the higher nitrogen content made it easier to breathe because you don't have to work as hard to get air. Of course, that wasn't the best part. The air was so thick that we could fly our wings were spread out. Glide pretty well on Venus. We could take off running and stay in the air until we were too tired to keep flapping. I got some pretty bad bruises trying to figure out how long that was, but I don't regret it at all. The views were stunning. Humanity stood between us and a universe that saw our species as strange, and we supported their desire to explore and learn for the sake of finding out interesting things. We were both better off because their asteroid belt was full of metals and rare earth elements, giving us all the raw materials we could want. Humanity had long ago decided that extraterrestrial resources belonged to the first person who found them, as long as they weren't in orbit around Earth or having mining drones on them. There was a glitch when we took an asteroid that wasn't in orbit around Earth. To complain that they weren't able to do much but grumble and warn us to make sure they hadn't already picked out our next target for operations. We became very close, and with our help, they found and settled 2 more planets. In return, we helped them find and adapt another hell planet, as they joked, as a candidate for colonization. I was so busy with the talks, planning and carrying out the terraforming, and coordinating the release of flora years later, I remembered to ask about that early on untranslatable word they had used. You can imagine how surprised I was to learn it was the name of a creature from their mythology. Depending on who told the story, the guardians of unfathomable knowledge often ruled over elemental forces and were always unbelievably powerful dragons. I can't say I didn't like the comparison, and I guessed correctly. Of course, our calm and businesslike behavior made them think that the other races that had told them about us might have been motivated by fear rather than real information. They weren't as racist as the rest of the intelligent species, and they weren't as cut off from the rest of the galaxy's community as we were, since most of them were willing to do business with them, even if they didn't like them. When it came to humans, we still had to deal with them, even though our ally protected us from the hate of the rest of the universe. This was because, even though we were the best at building ships, there were some things, like medical techniques and internet service, that needed help from humans. Humanity was still very behind the times when it came to technology, so even though they wanted to help, there were times when they couldn't. Even with our small help, the relative tech advantage was closing rather quickly. One thing I didn't expect to happen, nor did any of us, was progress in protecting the environment. It seems that people are naturally curious. They want to know how, why, and what. When they see something strange, they poke at it. In this case, it was us. They had never imagined something like this. It was hard for them to study us because they would suffocate and fry if they ever took off their suits. So, they spent a lot of time and money making environment suits that were lighter but still could handle the high temperatures and pressures we needed. In less than 20 years, or about 10 years for you humans, they went from suits that looked like the ones they first wore to suits that were much more comfortable. Jacket, how do I know what they're like? Well, it turns out that with a few tweaks, these suits are just as good at keeping heat and air out as they are in. I'll tell you what, once you get past the fact that it's cold enough to freeze you in less than a minute, Earth has some pretty amazing things. For example, there's this animal that looks like someone put rainbow pieces together and animated them. Some of them even gather in huge swarms to migrate. The right place at the right time of year to see trees completely covered in them. The tour guide said that branches have been known to break under their collective weight, which seems impossible since each one couldn't weigh more than a gram or two. Of course, this created a lot of opportunities for tourism. Another interesting thing about people is that they love spending their money on trinkets and other small items. When I asked Lee about this, the ambassador, whose name was "Dragons don't build hordes like humans do," I would have stuck my tongue out at her if it hadn't meant slobbering on my faceplate. Strangely enough, that has the same meaning for us as it does for humans. Life isn't always easy, though, and it looks like the universe decided to throw us a few storms. Humans were still trying to find cheaper ways to build star drives, but the latest drive's efficacy was not good. Only 3 times as much if you had a ready supply of ore, like from an asteroid belt full of rare earth elements. For the past 14,400 years, we had been giving away star drives for free. If there was ever something that could make the Senate go crazy, it was the fact that we had been undercharging by 60% on our main source of revenue. Humanity wasn't happy when they found out either, though their anger was mostly divided between the unfairness of when they found out. They reluctantly agreed to pay the right price for their drives from then on. It was a small comfort, but one that we would remember once the whole mess was cleared up. As a sign of goodwill, the Senate decided to only charge them 70% of the full price. I guess the people in charge wanted to make sure that we stayed on the good side of our only allies. When we raised our prices, we expected some backlash, but the storm it caused was worse than we thought. They were about to declare war on us, and the Thek and Ranu weren't far behind. Apparently, we were supposed to just sit there and take it like good little WG slaves. We may not like fighting, but we're not going to put up with being cheated at every turn. Some hotheads wanted to feed them some nukes to see how they liked it, but luckily common sense won out, and we told them that we had made big changes to the drive, and that they could say goodbye to the Antaran years, which is 50 Venusian years since we began keeping track of Venusian years. Of course, keeping them close meant that the humans also got the fully improved drives. Our alliance with them was as strong as ever, and the fact that the new drives were so much better than the old model helped their wallets a little, though there was a lot of complaining that the price of the upgrades was way too high. Of course, such big leaps in technology have. It was interesting to see how quickly they seemed to appear to work on the newest industry. Now that we could visit each other's labs thanks to the new environment suits, our joint research really took off, no pun intended. Thank you very much. We had never had someone who saw the world differently look over our notes, and I have to say that they filled in and added to some things we hadn't thought of. Same thing, it's amazing how many times it takes before both sides run out of ideas. In the 20 years we worked together seriously, there were at least 5 major advances in drive technology, 2 in weapons, 6 in neuroscience, 2 applied to humans, and 4 to us. And 18 in medical science. Pardon my bad language, but the emphasis is necessary. Among them was a real anti-aging technology that made our lives over 40% longer. I don't think there had ever been an alliance like ours before. Most species stay alone and never let another race into their labs, but humans didn't care about how things were done, and we were just glad to have each other. I was young enough to get the long-term anti-aging treatment, so I knew I would be around for a long time even without it. The two of us would have seen the universe slowly change around us. Surprisingly, in less than 50 years, our society had gone from being a race of paras to a valued ally. I barely remember the days when I was a lowly communications tech, talking through text and channels about starship repairs to people who would rather I didn't exist. But life goes on, I guess. Then it happened. The ultimate development in star drives. As long as there has been FTL, there has been a limit WA. If a starship comes out of FTL too close to a planet, the planet gets fried if it's lucky and torn apart if it's not. This is why terraforming is so expensive. Getting anywhere in sublight takes a very long time, and carrying a huge load of atmosphere makes it go even slower, since the amount of energy needed and the top speed depend on mass, and compressed air isn't much lighter than water. To terraform a planet, do the following. Usually, a gas giant would travel to a planet at sublight speed, filter out the gases they want, and compress them into tanks. It would then take another few weeks to fill up the hold, 2 or 3 months to get far enough away so as not to blow the gas giant up, and then enter FTL and spend a short eternity all in the atmosphere to the rock they want to live on. This would happen several hundred times with several dozen ships, but now there was no limit. It would be fine to exit almost on top of a planet, as the poor pilot found out when he made a mistake entering his coordinates, probably because he was shocked. Not that I blame him. When I heard the results of the alpha test, I felt like my legs gave out from under me. Now, instead of spending decades and billions or trillions of dollars hauling air and water to make a planet habitable, we could find one that already had an atmosphere and hydrosphere. It would take a lot of time and money to plant plants on the planet, but according to the FAA, it could be ready for the first stages of seeding in less than 10 Venusian years or 6 Terran years. Not only that, but normal shipping and interstellar travel would take a lot less time as well. I left that meeting with a lot of ideas. We could control all shipping and travel and make paradises out of detritus. I went to get a strong drink because these developments were so far beyond anything any other species had access to that I couldn't believe they were happening. In the end, we decided to keep these new drives a trade secret and not share them with anyone until someone else developed them on their own. They were a huge benefit, and I won't deny that there was some vengeful delight in being in charge of them. For more than 1,000 years, we mostly resisted the urge to make them pay a lot of money, though we may have added a few extra surcharges for species that had been especially mean to us in the past. The humans were mumbling about the huge military benefits, but we stood our ground. Trying to take over a strong race while their friends are trying to beat you up is a losing battle, no matter how many bells and whistles you add to your plan. You can get all the benefits of having a vassal without any of the problems. Planets with water and a breathable atmosphere are much less common than barren rocks. If someone could turn those barren rocks into habitable worlds in a fraction of the time it took any other race, they could charge almost infinite prices. That wasn't even talking about what it would mean for shipping and interstellar travel. The possibilities were mind-boggling. They had 2 options. They could terraform their planets the old-fashioned way, which would take 20 to 50 years plus the time needed to plant plants and get FAA approval, or they could pay us half the price and get a livable planet in half the time. Even with the time needed to plant plants and get FAA approval, anyone with 2 brain cells came to us, no matter how little they liked us. We had the rest of the universe by the balls, and it felt so good, especially. No one was friends with us because everyone saw us as freaks of nature, and the only thing that kept them from killing us all out of pure disgust was the fact that they could use us as a race that they could trick into paid slavery. I took another big gulp of my drink, hoping that the pins and needles would take my mind off of the dark turn my thoughts had taken. When had I become a nostalgic old geezer? But then again, Doesn't everyone become a nostalgic old geezer? Eventually, I finished my drink and paid my bill. Talking to the newly formed Terraforming Requisition Board about a contract to terraform at least 10 planets. Since they have been so nice to us in the past and are also desperately overcrowded and poor, we might just give them a break. The rest of my life looked like it was going to be fun.